Councillor Rush. Good afternoon, everyone. So we thought it was a good opportunity and a good time for us to give you quite a fulsome update on the water reform process. Understanding that you've listened to Helen this morning in public participation. So we've got 3 presentations for you, which kind of were aimed to give you an idea of, from the policy and governance perspective, what's happening with that working group that Doug Martin is chairing, what's happening with the National Transition Unit, which Marlon is leading, and then what does that actually mean for WCC and those entity C councils. So we've had to change the order slightly because Marlon's got another commitment that he needs to get away to. But I'll introduce Marlon first. So Marlon his whole career has been pretty much in water. He spent the last 13 years with water care. He's currently his substantive position is Deputy CE with water care. And Marlon is the interim transition unit lead. So he's leading the National Transition Unit. So we'll start off with Marlon's presentation. Then we'll kick into Doug's presentation, and then we'll have Dougal come and talk to us. So we're thinking around about 20 minutes for presentation. I'll keep an eye on, do you want me to keep an eye on questions, Councillor Rush? Or do you want to do that?
Yes, I'm just, if you can, that'll be great. We'll double team on that one. Yeah,
cool. So we'll take questions at the end. So we'll have 20 minutes for a bit of a presentation. I know Doug wanted more of a informal chat, so he hasn't got any presentation, but that's fine. So that'll be more of a conversation piece, I suspect. And we'll have questions at the end. So we're aiming to do about half an hour per speaker. Has anyone got any questions? Oh. Okay.
Marlon, thanks so much for coming to see us. We're looking forward to hearing from you, so I'll leave it with you.
Kia ora koutou ngā rangatira, kua hui mai nei I tēnei rā tēnā koutou katoa. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about what the National Transition Unit is up to. Look, I've provided a slide pack that's very extensive in terms of what the NTU is doing at an operational level. I appreciate there are some elements missing, but I'm happy to have conversations about that. I don't intend to go through the whole slide pack in the 20 minutes or so. In fact, I want to leave time for questions, so I might make it as short as we can. But I think the first slide I'm really keen to get to is the better off slide, which is on slide 4, if we can. That's it. So from a Wellington City Council perspective, I know this would be an area that you're keenly interested in, having spoken recently to the executive team there around the expectation that Wellington City Council will do reasonably well through the first tranche of what better off looks like. And we have more details coming out in the next few weeks, and I'm hoping to have someone like Sarah Hay as CFO sit in the workings and mechanics of how this payment scheme will work. And that'll be a great privilege for us to have her on board if we can. Now, at the moment, the funding itself is set up in a way that there will be the first tranche available, which is around $500 million from 1 July. And that means payment out as soon as possible. So, you know, it'll meet the criteria under the LGNZ Heads of Agreement with the Crown. But this is not something that is really about spending the funding on Three Waters infrastructure. This is as everyone will know, this is about the better off as a result of any disaggregation of the water industry part of the business. So, you know, this is really just a snapshot. We'll have more information, but it's really, I'm really keen to make sure that Council understands that this is a process that can be heavily involved in, but also that the funding is available relatively soon for this. So the next slide might be useful as well in terms of how we intend to support councils through this process. So one of the key aspects of what we've heard over the last few months is really how councils will be supported through the BAU. And we hear loud and clear that there is an element of poaching going on in the industry as councils, as consultants are gearing up potentially for Three Waters reform by taking some of your best staff. And I'm talking Wellington Water in particular, but we are cognizant of making sure that any staff that come across from councils are remunerated as a result of their investment in time and effort into this process. So as recent as this morning, I had a conversation with Colin Crampton around how we could better do that from a Wellington Water perspective. I have an expectation that Wellington Water is one of the more sophisticated entities in the industry. They will have a lot to contribute to the National Transition Unit as we try to quickly decentralise as much as possible what the regionalisation of these entities looks like. So really, it was just a snapshot to show you that while an entity like Wellington Water may be a key part of this, we won't leave them high and dry as part of the transition process itself. And that may include staff from Wellington City Council as well. The next slide is also an important one from an overall perspective, just to give you a heads up on how we intend to run the program. We're looking at setting up some key reference groups that will look at areas around people, asset management, finance and commercial. And these are really the leadership roles that we're seeking advice from and guidance around the key areas we've got in our plans and how we intend to deliver these. So it's really important that everyone understands that this transition reference group criteria is not limited to those in the water industry, but it is about giving guidance to key areas that are required from a successful delivery of day one operations of these new entities. And that's our goal. So from an operational perspective, these are about a day a month at most, and they will require significant input from key individuals in the water industry. So we're really keen to make sure the best get the opportunity to have their say and lead us through this process. So I might just flick through to discovery, which is about slide 11, I think, if you can. Just to give you a sense, or actually the one before would be really good to bring back. So just in terms of the engagement, the key pathways that we see this working are that while councils and specifically Wellington Water will continue their BAU operations, you know, we're cognizant of the fact that as these, we've got to get to day one, and we can't plan beyond day one if there's nothing available for us to plan towards. So our thinking is that we'll bring a lot more of this BAU in-house in terms of a work stream to help councils get through the concerns they're facing around resourcing constraints and the ability to provide resources as we move through the delivery of this program. But the model in front of here is an attempt to show how that engagement could work. And what we're seeing out in the regions at the moment is the formation of what we're deeming or terming local transition teams. These local transition teams have been created out of a void of a lack of leadership, I suppose, in this space. And while we're setting up to create the local establishment entities ultimately as soon as possible, we see this as a happy medium in the interim to provide the most efficient way to provide that guidance and support through the regional entities themselves. So we're keen to work with these entities as they've been created. We know there's one being set up in Entity C. We know there's probably two that we're aware of. And these go through all layers, mayoral, CEs, and at an officer level. We're probably talking more at an officer level here. I have to acknowledge the partnership directors from a DIA perspective that have the overarching relationship with councils, and we're working with them, and we'll see the appointment of iwi liaison officers as part of Three Waters. And that close-knit team of our council interface managers, who I know have been meeting with many CEs, and Ian McSherry, who's on the call, is the leader of the Entity C interface process, and he's been providing support and guidance on what the NTU has been up to. That is a key part of the interface for the National Transition Unit, and he has a significant role in our entity about providing that leadership and information through, as well as the technical support at an officer level to ensure that everyone is working towards the same outcomes and we're not wasting effort as these local transition teams are being formed. So next slide, I just want to talk about the discovery phase, which is I know this is a time-consuming process for councils. We've had feedback from the previous reform process of discovery where something like 20,000 lines were asked for. We're certainly not trying to do that. We're talking about the best way to do this is being in waves. If we could have answered a couple of slides, please. One more. Thank you. This is the best way to articulate what we're trying to do. While you've got a detailed slide that follows, really we're taking this waves approach where in the last few weeks we've asked for information around the people in the water industry and their roles to get obviously some clarity over their best pathway forward. Transition is key, and successful transition of all staff in the water industry is our top priority, as well as ensuring that they have the best opportunities at securing the roles they want in the new entities. Obviously, these roles will differ from their existing roles and will require different technical skills. So at the moment, our focus around people is getting every individual as ready as possible for those roles in the new entity. The next phase of what we see this discovery phase playing out is around data and digital. We've got to make some really quick decisions around what the systems look like in these new entities. And a key part of that is understanding what the landscape is now. Asset management then becomes a critical element as we look to build our AMPs for day one. And that requires us being ready for their first initial AMPs by 1 July 2023. And what we're trying to do there is actually just take the best of what's available now and collating that as our starting point, and then looking for those opportunities to provide the benefits of what Three Waters reform can show through this process. And obviously that'll require a lot of consultation back with councils, back with Wellington Water in terms of how we can best achieve some of those outcomes. But ultimately, we're seeing that this is a process that needs to happen from day one. And experience from other reforms shows that when new entities are formed, time has been taken to plan. And the instance around Auckland in 2010, it nearly shut down the industry. So we're really cognizant of the fact that we need to provide these AMPs that are ready to go with a spade in the ground on day one, while councils continue to deliver their LTPs in accordance with what they'd set forth in their programs. From that, you see the customer pricing information required. That's again critical from what does day one look like? What does the forward funding plan look like to support the asset management plan? So those two work in conjunction with each other. And the reality is we just need to explore those options and make sure that we've got a pathway that is suitable for most in terms of what the outcomes of this process looks like. And I give an example of what even status quo looks like within regions. If I pick on entity C, you could see potentially a laundromat that's owned by an individual in Hawke's Bay and in Wellington, potentially paying two different prices on day one, then questioning why that's the case when a single entity has been formed. So we're just looking at what that means from a customer expectation point of view and providing information that others can make a decision around. And then ultimately what we're looking at is what those key contracts are, the phasings of those, how we can look to provide some of that scale potentially. What a key principle we've got at the moment is around localism. So we've heard that loud and clear, making sure that we're supporting the local communities to thrive. Money's not going in and then coming out of those communities as a result of any new arrangements that are created. So we're really cognizant of making sure we get that, but that's not information we need right now. The last slide I probably just want to talk about before we start a conversation is not the next slide, probably slide 13 if we can. So this is really what the focus of the work is inside the NTU right now. And these are the work streams we've set up with key leaders inside each of those to help deliver the outcomes required. So what you've got on the following slides is really just a snapshot of what this year looks like in terms of key deliverables. Our focus is around deliverables rather than activities. We're keen to show that from a technical a management of this program perspective, that we're focused on outputs and outcomes. So yes, we've got what we think the ideal situation looks like for day one, and we're happy to share all that information. We've got a really detailed plan to help achieve that. We've got a risk management framework overlaying that to address and mitigate any of the risks around delivery of the program. And we've got to focus on the next 90 days. But what we're showing in these slides that follow are really just a snapshot of the key deliverables over the next 12 months. Because we're getting questions around what's the detail. And we're happy to provide the full spreadsheet, but I don't think anyone really wants to look at hundreds of lines of information on a spreadsheet. Really what they want to understand is what key outputs are you delivering when, and what requirements as councils do we need to provide to make sure that you meet those deadlines. So really just wanted to give a high level snapshot. I'm happy to stop there and really just get some questions around what that means and how we can support and get support through this process.
Okay, thanks for that, Marlon. Colleagues, have you got any questions? Put your hand up. I've got a few I need to dig through. So, Marlon.
Hello. Hello, how are you? I'm all right, how are you?
Beth, you need to mute. There we go.
So I missed what happened then, but so Marlon, I've got a few questions. I've just jotted them down, so I might as well whiz through. So when you talked through this funding update, you talked about concerns that Wellington Water would have around staff, being attracted elsewhere. You kind of concluded by acknowledging that. I wasn't quite clear with you. Acknowledged that and said that will apply to Wellington City Council as well. So is that what you meant?
Yeah, look, I think so, because we've had, because a lot of the positions are based out of Wellington, we have had people reach out to us from within the council. So, obviously the opportunity to work on something that I'm calling a once in a lifetime event, I can't just limit it to Wellington Water, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, understood. Okay. And that's totally natural as well, but it's good to understand that. I'm just wondering, you mentioned digital data or data digital.
Yes.
I mean, presumably each entity will be wanting to standardize their IT systems and their document management systems and their monitoring systems. And I've done this before in, other contexts, so it's quite a challenge, but are you guys on top of all that?
Yes, in fact, we've been using the CIO inside Wellington Water to help us support a decision around the best pathway forward. So we've been using a number of reference groups. We've even had an external technical reference group from people outside the industry. And what we're looking at is, because we have to provide a system that can deliver success on day one, status quo really isn't an option, and status quo is potentially as expensive as what a potential new system could look like. So we're using the term minimum viable product, but what that means is not really the basic core by day one. It really just says, what is the path of least resistance to the biggest opportunity to have success through this process? So that's our view on what day one looks like. And what does that mean in practical terms? Well, there are a couple of real key options that we're exploring now. One is obviously the water care solution and what that offers. It is currently running inside a $12 billion organisation with $800+ million worth of revenue. And guess what? Entity C looks like that, the new Entity C. So, why would you reinvent the wheel? There are tweaks you would potentially make, but when you've got an instance that's live, why wouldn't you consider that as a real viable option? Same as what we've been looking at is what Christchurch City Council has. They're running a SAP solution that they've got a lot of confidence over. So we're exploring that as an opportunity as well. We don't intend to bring something new in. I think that's too high risk. Timeframes that we're leading to for 1 July 24, we need to start as soon as we can. So what we're trying to do is build as much knowledge and experience and bring it into the tent to help make those decisions, and then share that as fast as we can so that we're not leaving people on a journey as to what this could look like and why we've gone down a particular path. So it is a very significant decision, and we're not taking it lightly.
Okay, Councillor Pannett. Oh,
Sorry, pressing too many buttons. Thanks a lot, Marlon, for coming in. So it seems that you are assuming that this is all going to go ahead, but obviously there's an election in between this. There is significant community concern. So I'm just curious about whether you've got the ability to pivot if necessary.
The answer to that is yes. There are a lot of, we're calling them failback or fallback positions, but ultimately some of the things that we're investing in right now, and I'll pick on the asset management plan. So what we're trying to do there is set up some national frameworks around key inputs to the national, to the first AMPs of these entities. And good examples are a climate change framework, right? And a zero harm framework, a product specification framework, a design specification framework, all are key inputs to what would be the first AMPs of the new entity and can be delivered at a national level. So for me, that's not wasted effort. These are things that the industry should have. The fact that, you can look at some of the councils now and there are 87 different design pump stations, which means you have to carry 87 different parts and products. I'm sitting there going, that's not efficient. As an industry, we should have sorted that out decades ago. Yeah. So it's not wasted effort to try and get this to a point where we can see success regardless of what outcomes occur through this process.
Thanks. My next question is just around environmental standards, which many of us have, tried to fight on, and it's quite slow progress. Are you confident that you've got the resources and frameworks in place to really see a significant uplift in performance there?
Yes,
so it's a big question.
Yeah, there's a big question. There's so many parts to that. Look, if I just pick on the maintenance of networks, I'll just use that as an example. So right now, I can tell you there are 67 different levels of service in the way we manage our networks across the country. And that's just the district councils, let alone stormwater and the regional councils. So the opportunity to pick up some of those and put them in legislation or through regulation. So regulation is a great example of where we'll be able to lift the standards in terms of the level of service around operational management on our networks. So the regulator, once the economic regulator comes in, they'll formulate a pathway, not necessarily within the first 5 years of the operation of the entity, but they'll have clarity beyond that. So with that and taumata arawai, improving the quality standards in the systems and the networks and the discharge points and everything else, you should see a significant improvement in the performance of these entities over time. So while that doesn't give you comfort now as to what line of sight looks like, there is a pathway that, with the help of the economic regulator, some of the legislation that's being drafted in Bill 2, and the taumata arawai situation that's active now and just needs to follow its own regulations and rules, you'll see substantial changes in environmental outcomes.
We don't have much time. And the last question just is around community participation and voice. As you'll know, there is a lot of concern around that people will be shut out, and also just the complexities of integrating a whole lot of planning regimes with these new regional committees which are being proposed and these new entities. Is there any up-to-date thinking about how that will be facilitated?
Yeah, look, let me talk about some of the outcomes that we're driving inside the NTU. So it is our intention to have as much of a process, what I would call deliberative democracy. It's been effective in many utilities overseas, involved in the decision-making of the outcomes that we're expecting through the Three Waters reform process. So there are layers. While we'll be making decisions that will impact day one operations of the entities, these won't be made in isolation. They will involve the industry, and it is our intent to bring processes like deliberative democracy through the fold to make sure that things like pricing, people have an understanding of what the options could look like, and we have a view from customers, consumers, as to what that could mean. So from a program perspective, I can provide some confidence that we're looking to build those relationships. We need to work with councils to make sure we have access to customers, because I'm not jumping the gun and saying we can just do this without any involvement, but also working within the structures that councils have through the LTP processes, special consultative processes, to try and marry up the fact that we'll be looking to develop an AMP, but we want to work beside you on the development of the annual plan process or long-term plan process, to ensure we're working together as we work through this process.
Good. Deputy Mayor Free.
Yeah, thank you, Marlon. It's interesting stuff. But I guess my concerns follow a similar line of questioning to Councillor Pannett. It does seem like you're quite a long way down the track, and yet from my perspective as a councillor, there's quite a bit missing, including the charging regimes, who's going to be responsible for the billing, who's going to be responsible for taking the complaints. How will you actually pay for this? Because there's no doubt, it's not a free ride. People will still have to pay. So I guess for me, these are fundamentals, and I feel like we're a long way down the track without some of the fundamentals. That's my first question.
Yep. So in terms of the fundamentals of what we're trying to do, I think what we've got is a plan. Nothing's actually been actioned to deliver the plan, but at least what we're trying to do is be open and transparent about our thinking. So yes, there are some key decisions that need to be made, and ultimately there are some forums that exist now that will help with that solutioning. So the Water Steering Committee that currently exists, I would envisage that they will have a role in seeing some of the initial work that comes out over the coming months or years as a result of this process. So yes, the billing one is a big rock, right? A huge risk and a big rock to the program, and it will need a lot of clarity, a lot of communication, and a lot of transparency over what those options look like. So while I'm showing you a plan, I'm not showing you a pathway that's set in concrete. I just need to give everyone visibility as to what it looks like, so we can share a possible way to deliver this program on time.
Yeah, and yet there's no sort of concrete plan, but staff are starting to be attracted away from what we've got at the moment and to other entities. That's going to put quite a big risk over our current way of working. So my second question was about local representation, and it was suggested to us by a submitter this morning that in terms of iwi representation, and I don't pretend to be an expert at all, but she said, maybe it's better for iwi, and I wouldn't have a view, but I invite you to answer this. Do you consider it might be better for iwi to have more of a say over smaller geographical parts rather than a say over a very big entity like Area C? And has there been any research or thinking done about that, or consultation with iwi themselves?
I'm going to leave that question for Doug to answer when he comes on. I mean, I don't have a personal view on it, and I don't know what. As the NTU, our role is to deliver the outcomes from various processes, policy, legislation, whatever it is. So we're taking what principles have been agreed to date, and we're helping formulate a plan. I'm waiting for the governance group to come out with their findings, and we'll help implement that solution. I can give you some of the thinking around it, but I'd be remiss in giving you the wrong answer.
Okay, I thought it was a valid point she raised. I'm just interested to see, and maybe another submission will clear it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, can we move on, Councillor Condi?
Thanks, Marlon. I just want to acknowledge just the amazing complexity of the work that you have ahead of you, and thank you and all your staff for everything that's going into that. I was just interested in you brought up the phrase deliberative democracy, and I'm a huge fan of deliberative democracy, but I'm also a bit of a cynic because in my experience, often when people use that phrase, they don't actually have the organizational capability to back it up. So my question for you is, how confident are you that you actually have the organizational capability to deliver on that kind of deliberative democracy approach? And can you be more specific about what it means? Because it's a phrase that can mean many things to many people.
So I should let you know that I was also the Chief Customer Officer at Watercare for 4.5 years. So we use the principles and concepts through many and varying different ways. So to give you a really specific example, because I appreciate time is moving on, I'm going to pick on growth. and developers specifically. So what we created within a deliberative democracy framework was a way to engage with developers on key questions around pricing and planning. And what we did was not necessarily go to hundreds of developers, because in Auckland, for example, we were completing 15,000 plus houses a year. We said, okay, who is producing most of these houses? And we got down to 20 key individuals who were producing 60% of the housing in Auckland. And from that 20%, from those 20 individuals, we were able to construct detailed conversations around varying topics, such as charging, such as operational management of connections. So within those contexts, we were able to then think about the key decision points that would involve customers and outcomes that they could buy into. So at the moment, I'm going to pick on Watercare again, the charge to connect for growth is $16,000. It jumped 50% in 5 years without anyone arguing about it. For me, that's the success of deliberative democracy through a process that's involved their engagement as they understood the complexities of what we were dealing with, the need for growth, the need for them to continue to make money, but also not see this as a massive charge that, you know, they're paying $2,000 in some of the districts that are near us. Yet they're happy to pay the $16,000 for confirmation of surety to get a connection when they need it, and confidence in our ability to meet their demands. So for them, that was the highest priority, and that's only stuff you can get through close engagement through these sorts of processes.
Okay, Jenny. Councillor Calvert.
Thank you, and thank you. It just, and I missed the first few minutes at the start, and you may have touched on this. So this seems like a complete reset of the of government's approach to introducing the Three Waters reform. Would that, because I'm seeing what I'm hearing now is a lot different to what I heard last year.
Look, I can't answer that. I can only answer what I know now, and what I've been tasked to do as a team is pull together a plan that will help deliver some of the key objectives that have been set out in Cabinet Paper 4 for day one. And from my experience of being involved in transitions such as the Waikato District Council, the Super City at Watercare, Manukau Water Limited, I've just brought some of those experience together. I've got some international contacts that have helped us with Tasmanian Water and a few others. So I don't know what language was used last year. All I know is in order for this to be successful right now, it involves a lot of collaboration. Mm. And that means a lot of working together rather than sitting in isolation in a room and making decisions on behalf of everyone else. Yeah. Well, from my perspective, it does seem like it's been a major reset. So that which is what was needed. It was referred to. We had a presentation from a mayor who's on behalf of a number of councils who have come together as a collective with concerns about the Three Water reforms based on what was from last year. So how is your engagement going with them? Because what they're saying too has some validity, and probably commonality with us. Yep, that's a great question. I mean, I've had conversations with the mayor and CEO of Waimakariri, and I've tried to reach out to Rob Forlong at Whangarei, and to be honest, he's the only person who hasn't answered my call. And he raised the legal challenge, and it's fair enough. So, but generally, when I'm out there talking to councils, and I know Ian would say the same thing, we've had a very good reception, and people are prepared to park the differences they have and the matters that are important to them to make sure that we're not impeding the pathway to success on this program, should it move forward in the direction that it's heading now.
Yeah, and they did acknowledge that the status quo is not, you can't keep the status quo. There does need to be change. So, and so where's Let's Get Welly? I'm not Let's Get Welly, sorry, I've got that on my mind, but local government New Zealand in this now, because that I think that sort of surprised a few of us that the council, which we're all members individually of almost, had sort of approved the government's approach at the time as it was last year. So just interested to understand what relationship and how that works that you have with local government New Zealand at the moment.
Yeah, look, it's a conversation that's been really supportive to date, but without any substance. So what we're trying to do is get some real action on the ground, because yes, this needs to happen through Taituara and LGNZ and Water New Zealand and any other industry body that's happy to be part of this process. But it's got to be real. It's got to be practical too, because at the moment, there's some really good agreements in place, but nothing's really happening. So what we're trying to do is set up what that next phase of work could look like and how we use them as a conduit to provide a voice that's strong and loud through this process.
Okay. And our, obviously there's also local government reform work happening at the same time. Is there any connection in with that work?
Just sharing of ideas at this point. I mean, while we all sit in the same building, I definitely touch base with Sarah and Richard Ward around key things that are happening. They're very interested in understanding what's happening in Three Waters. So there's a strong connection, but no real direct interface, if that makes sense.
And just one final question, your timeline that you have, I mean, I know it's a couple of years away, but that will go quickly with everything else that's going on as well. Is that enough time?
Yes, but some things need to start sooner rather than later. And I'll pick on ICT. That's a major roadblock. Any new system implementation will take 18 months to 2 years. So if I don't have a system up and running or an option selection process determined by July this year, we're going to struggle to meet the timeframe. So it's a risk that I'm highlighting. And the challenges I'm facing are things such as better business cases through the Treasury process, but we're working through them. I can only move at pace to help bring people along on the journey, but that's a real challenge right now. And we need to start some things like that as soon as possible. So we've identified all the bottlenecks. We now need to just remove them and work through processes to make sure we can deliver this program on time. But am I confident as it today? Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thanks for that, Marlon. Now, were you going to continue on with some more of those slides, or?
No, look, I apologise that I dumped a whole lot, and I knew I only had 20 minutes, but I thought it was just valuable to understand a little bit more richness than, just me blurting on for 40 minutes and not really providing any substance to the slides you've already seen.
Well, like I say, I didn't get a run sheet, so I didn't realise it was only 20 minutes. We've been 40 now. So, Siobhan, I understand the speaking order got changed anyway. So is Doug coming next, or?
Yes, so thank you, Marlon. That was really, really great. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate the opportunity.
So next we have Doug Martin. So Doug is the chair of the Representation, Governance and Accountability Working Group. So this was a working group that was established late last year to really take a fresh look at the entity design with specific focus on representation, governance and accountability. So they've had around 6 meetings today. I think Doug is probably very busy writing up the final report as we speak. Our representation from NTCC on that working group was Mayor Campbell Barry, as well as Mayor Rachel Reese as well. So she's been representing NTCC councils on that group. Doug Martin may be well known to some of you as very experienced advisor in public sector organisational performance. I think he's the Martin of Martin Jenkins. So he's had a very extensive career. So I think he wanted to keep this fairly informal. Doug, I'll hand it over to you. If you're happy to take questions as we go through, I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, let's treat it as a chat, shall we? More than anything else. And look, I hope the connection's all right. I've been classified as a close contact, which I dare say all of us will be at some stage. So I'm confined to quarters at home, and I've had a somewhat erratic internet connection, which, but I've got a new computer, so and more powerful computer. So I hope it doesn't it doesn't cause difficulties. And if it does, I'll just have to apologise in advance. I'm also a little bit croaky, not because of COVID, I hope. I've been talking most of the morning and a fair bit of yesterday, and my old throat doesn't hold up as well as it used to. But look, thank you for that introduction. Just give you a bit of a sense of how we've got about this work. So I'm the chair of the working group. We have essentially 9 mayors. We have 9 iwi reps, reps from LGNZ and officials, and so it's quite a party really. And by the time we get everybody together, there's probably 40 odd people, and which is a logistical challenge in its own right, of course. So the terms of reference were kind of established for us, which is really they respond to concerns from the sector about the strength of governance, representation, and accountability mechanisms. That's what they stem from, and the terms of reference identify a couple of bottom lines, which are kind of no-go zones in a way, from our point of view. One is the principle of co-governance, and that is a key bottom line for the government. And the other is actually the principle of balance sheet separation. The idea behind that is that the balance sheets of most councils are pretty much maxed out, and so if you get that balance sheet separation, have the financial arrangements basically incorporated within the financial statements of the water service entities, then those entities have more headroom to borrow to actually make the investments necessary for the future and to spread the costs of those investments over future generations. So they were a couple of the kind of bottom lines, and people tend to get distracted by that. I think we could say quite honestly that we've actually had a sort of blank sheet of paper sort of approach. And the reason I was keen to do that is that if you take a very narrow legal view of terms of reference, you can actually end up missing out on a whole lot of good ideas, because things come in from different angles. So we've actually adopted pretty much a blank sheet of paper approach. And I said that at the start, I think, when I addressed mayors and councillors through LGNZ. Our work has proceeded in 2 phases, pre-Christmas and post-Christmas. The pre-Christmas phase was really all about information download, if you like. And we've had, we had truckloads of paper to read, but we've had some really interesting presentations as well from officials, but also from Hawke's Bay mayors, from the Campaign for Local Democracy, gave a good presentation on their point of view. And we've also had some written submissions from places like Hamilton City and others. And so that has caused us to look, if you like, at a range of kind of different models. So that was what I'd call the information sort of gathering download phase. And post-Christmas, we've been moving really into deliberations. And what we're doing is taking a systematic sort of approach, and we're just basically working our way through alternative models, alternative ways of expressing ownership, for example, which has been something of a contentious issue. We're working our way through the governance arrangements through the regional representation group, and what does co-governance mean? How would that operate? Is it based on consensus decision making? If it is, then what happens if there's no consensus? What's the fallback sort of position? So we've had quite rich discussions around co-governance and what that means. We've also had paid a lot of attention, partly stimulated by, I think I saw Dougal online, by the Wellington Water Model, but also by some really good suggestions from Ngāi Tahu. And that's in and around, if you assume we have these 4 entities, just for argument's sake, then how do you bring a local voice to bear on decision making? So we've had a lot of discussion around, if you like, around the sub-regional level. That might actually be at a catchment level, and the idea there is to make sure that the decision-making processes aren't just top-down; they're also bottom-up, and that priorities that relate to local catchment areas are basically brought forward to the regional representation group. So we've had a good look at that. We've had a
you're there. I see Councillor Condi's got her hand up for a question.
Yeah, if she wants to.
Oh, no rush. Happy for Doug to actually finish up.
Okay.
I was on a bit of a roll.
You were actually, but you did say we'll take them as we come. But anyway,
I'm very happy to do that. But look, I'll finish because I'm more interested in having a chat to you than you listening to me. We spent a lot of time on the governance dimension, and of course, one of the criticisms of what the government originally proposed was that there was quite a complicated governance structure with different levels around board appointments and so forth. The exposure bill that was made available to us actually had moved to simplify the governance structure somewhat, although that hasn't been picked up widely. Anyway, so we've talked about that. We've then really talked about the whole issue of accountability and the accountability of the water service agencies to the regional representation group. And basically, under the exposure bill, the water service agencies are required to give effect to a statement of service and performance expectations. That's quite strong, to give effect to. And what we've been talking about at length is, well, what does that mean? And if, for example, a water service entity comes back with a statement of intent, which is at odds or inconsistent with the statement of service and performance expectations, what happens? So we've been working through that issue. We've also been looking at the way in which the water service entities are held to account for their performance, and looking at issues like either 6-monthly or quarterly reporting back to the regional representation group. And we've also spent a lot of time on issues around representation and how the regional representation groups might be populated. I mean, that's probably best left to the constitutions of the RRG, but there's some particular issues with Entity A, with Auckland, because you have, obviously, I'm just telling you what you already know, a rather large player and a few and 3 really quite small players in the whole order of things. So it's really quite a disproportional sort of in that part of the world. And at the entity C, D, and E, B, C, and D level, looking at well, what does representation mean? Is it proportional, or is it basically essentially an egalitarian system where 1 vote per council? Should there's already a minimum? Should there be a maximum number of people on the RRG? And if so, how do you make sure that there'll be a proper balance between rural, provincial, and urban authorities? And equally, on the other side, on the iwi side, an appropriate balance between the different iwi, of which in some of the entities there are quite a multiple number of iwi. So we're just kind of working through all of these issues. And I suppose the sort of the general kind of direction of travel is to strengthen the governance and accountability arrangements. And there's a tension there between, on the one hand, councils and iwi exercising influence over the water service entities on the one hand, and achieving balance sheet separation on the other, because the more influence or control is exercised by councils and iwi in co-governance situation, the more likely that if things go bottom up, that in effect you won't, the balance sheets of the councils would still be involved, and that's something we don't want to see happen. So that's what we're doing. We've been meeting intensively. We've got a meeting this Friday, and we're due to report on the 7th of March. So it's pretty tight. And what that requires us to do is keep the reporting at the right level, rather than getting down into the weeds. We've just got to keep it at the right level. Otherwise, we'll just lose our way and not get there. The dynamics within the group have been really quite constructive, and there's been good, solid engagement. We're operating on the basis of consensus decision making. So basically, we're looking at what are the changes that we can agree on by consensus, and that'll be the focus, if you like. And there'll be other issues that won't be possible to reach agreement on, but so be it. But the approach is really to say, okay, what are the improvements we can agree on, and does this overall move things forward? That's the basic criteria. So we're right at the business end, and hopefully I don't get COVID. It'll be a challenge, or maybe it won't be. Anyway, that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for that, Doug. So Jenny, and then Iona.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Doug. It was great to just hear everything that you've been considering, and certainly you ticked off all of my boxes in terms of the things that I would like you to be considering. So that's very reassuring. My first question is just about how the governance model thinks about and talks about our residents, because I think one of my big issues is that there's really strong focus on customers and how do we protect customers and pricing and all of that. But the thing that I really see missing is how do we think about people who are members of Friends of Karori Stream and Friends of Ofero Stream, and those people who are our residents and see themselves as really engaged in the environmental protection?
Yes.
Because I don't see much of the role in the documentation so far, and in a way I almost don't even see a word for it. Like, it's quite hard to talk about a group of people if you don't have a name for them, because I think iwi are our katiaki. I'm not quite sure what to call these group of kind of our wonderful weekend volunteers who are out there trying to make a difference in their communities.
Yeah, that's a really important issue, and we're grappling with that, I can assure you. We haven't. It's not lost by any stretch of the imagination. It's a question of how that local voice basically comes through and influences the activities of the water service entities, and even the regional representation groups at the more strategic level. And that's still work in progress. But I can assure you, Councillor, it hasn't. It's front and centre of the, particularly the mayors, but also iwi have made exactly the same comments about hapu and about other groups in Māoridom that have established relationships that will have to change because the system changes, and you don't want to lose it. So it is front and centre, I can assure you. And there are some quite interesting ideas that we're still working through, albeit late in the day.
Thanks, Doug. I look forward to that. My other question was just about, which you raised, is about how we balance that desire for local voice with the issues around balance sheet separation. And I guess my question is really, how well do you think that people actually grasp the issues around balance sheet separation? How well do you think that members of your task force, but also just more widely elected members and mayors and whatnot, grasp the requirements of balance sheet separation? Because I think that's a really key point in terms of one of your bottom lines.
Absolutely. And how, to what extent is it grasped? Probably patchy, I'd say. So the working group has has been engaging directly with Standard & Poor's, for example, to get a sense around I mean, around the opportunity to strengthen accountability without compromising sort of balance sheet separation. And we as a working group won't get an answer to that. That's something that DIA in the end would get a formal ruling on once our recommendations are through to the minister. But we want to get some level of comfort around that. But at the end of the day, we'll do what we think is right, and I think there is a sweet spot where you can tighten up the accountability of the water service entities, transiting probably more in the direction of the CCO sort of model. And we can tighten that up without necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But we won't, in the end, know the final outcome of that.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Pennant. The Indomitable.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate your time. Can I just ask you a really big picture question?
Sure.
Because you talked about balance sheet separation, which tends to find a bit frustrating. That actually we're already one of the most centralised countries in the West, and why would we not be going the other way, and not just in water, and empowering local government to do more rather than just centralising power in a very, very small sphere, and potentially excluding people when we should be, with such a large entity, when we should be trying to get much, much more democratic.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very fair point of view. I mean, I can't respond too much on that, because you're striking at the heart of government policy there, which is in many respects, the general direction of travel has been established. And the issue there comes down to an argument of the benefits of scale, which is it's always a contentious issue, because firstly, what benefits and economies do you get out of scale? And to my mind, it's less financial. You can get some financial benefits out of scale, but it's probably as much around the capability and capacity of the entities. So these 4 entities aren't huge by international standards, and that's adjusted for population size. They're not remarkable from that point of view. So there's that. It's really that the extent to which we can actually benefit from scale. As I say, that's been a well debated issue within the working group, but I'd have to say the general direction is probably towards aggregation rather than disaggregation, as you rightly point out.
And just the other question relating to that is around accountability. And large-scale government entities aren't always, they're hard to hold to account. I mean, look at Oranga Tamariki or something like that. So how are these ones going to be held to account?
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually, because when you look at the system as a whole, the amount of discretion available to these entities is probably quite constrained. You've got the water standards regulator, you've got potentially a economic regulator. You've obviously got the government policy statement coming down from on high. You've got the statement of strategic and performance expectations from the RRG. So when you actually look at the system as a whole, and ask yourself, well, how much discretion do these entities have in practice? To what extent could they just run off and do their own thing? It's probably quite constrained, and I don't think that's kind of well understood. They're quite surrounded, in many respects. But that's a very fair point. There is always a risk that these entities will just take off and do their own thing. It's a very valid point, and that's why we're looking at really tightening up the accountability arrangements.
Good. Mayor Foster?
You're on mute, Andy.
Yes, yeah, I was just finding the button to unmute. Look, thanks, Doug. I just wanted to pick up on Iona's question, because obviously the issue of scale and the efficiencies which have been proposed has been absolutely critical to the model that we've got here, and obviously it has been hotly debated, and that's where we had that original proposition that was anything between 1 and 13 entities being proposed, and obviously there are significant differences in how close those are to local voices or how far away they are. You also mentioned Treasury doing a better business case, and I just wondered, is that going to include sort of examining the efficiencies that are said to have come from scale? Because the other bit is what you just said is there are efficiencies from scale financially, but there are also capacity ones. Now, the capacity ones, I would suggest, probably are unlikely to require that level of scale. But the efficiencies which we've been given, the numbers that this whole thing is predicated on, are so enormous that if they're not there to that scale, that's pretty fundamental. So we have to have a credible landing on this at the moment. I'm concerned by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers are pretty aggressive, you have to say. And watch the space. I don't want to sound irresponsible here, because it's a really serious issue. But the assumptions around financials do assume quite a significant level of savings arising from this reform. There's not much more I can say. The only thing I would say, Andy, is that another issue we've been looking at is the idea of a five-yearly review of how the whole system's operated. And that would be across all the parties, not just local authorities and iwi, but also the Crown. And we've discussed the merits of that it's always good once you have these big system changes to have a point at which you basically look back and say, well, what went right and what went wrong? And were our assumptions accurate or inaccurate? So we have been talking about that, because when you get into big system reform like this, there are unknowns, as we all know. There are unknowns, and it'll be, the proof will be in the pudding.
So can I just finish that? You said the numbers are pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
So is there a process to test those? Is that what the Treasury better business case will do? Is to test these and see whether they're actually robust or not?
Yeah. I mean, I think I haven't focused particularly on the Treasury better business case, but there will be assumption. There are a set of assumptions which around the financial benefits of this reform that will need to be tested at some point.
And so what if they are found to be either deficient in part or significantly deficient? Where does that leave us?
It probably leaves us in a position where you don't generate the full benefits of balance sheet separation. The entities will be more constrained in their ability to borrow and fund future borrowing.
And so does that go to, I mean, the numbers, sorry to pursue this, Chair, but does that go to the numbers? I mean, the amount that's been proposed to be spent is staggeringly large over the next 30 years. It's sort of 180 billion. Would that would presumably constrain that sum and mean that there'll be decisions that would need to be made about trade-offs within the aspirations that 180 billion reflects.
Yeah. And I mean, there's always uncertainty around these numbers. They're projections. I mean, basically, they're a set of projections. That's what they are.
No, okay? I understand that. Yeah.
And that's always the case with forecasting. So there are a set of projections based on certain assumptions, and I think that time will tell whether those projections are realised or not.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, folks? Good. Good. Well, Doug, so many thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us. I really appreciate that, recognising just how busy it is for you at this time. And you've been wonderfully clear. I didn't actually have to ask any questions in the end. So I really appreciate your work, and I look forward to seeing your report in due course, of course.
Quite soon, I dare say, but I'd have to say, doing this online is really challenging. And since Omicron, we've had to do all this online. You must find that as a council. It's really quite challenging because some of these are quite complex, and you need to eyeball people and observe the body language and so forth. So the circumstances have not been easy.
Well,
but anyway, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Well, you've done a great job, and also commend certainly I know Campbell Barry's been working hard. I'm guessing that the others have been as well. So
yeah, they're working hard, all right. Right. Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
Everyone. Thank you. And
Thank you.
So, Siobhan, is Dougal going to say a few words now? Or?
Yes, I'll hand over to Dougal. So Dougal will be known to all of you. He's presented to us a few times on water reforms, most recently just before Christmas. So he's been facilitating the regional working group, so really doing a lot of the legwork for us in terms of making sure that we keep up to date at an officer level with all of the different moving parts associated with water reform. So his presentation is really going to be looking at, having taken Doug's work and then Marlon's work with the NTU, what does it actually mean for us? So that'll be the next presentation. So over to you, Dougal.
Kia ora koutou, and thanks for the opportunity to join you. I'm calling in literally from next door to the City Council, so online, but close to home as well. Look, I know it's been quite a long discussion, so I'll make this pretty brief. And as Siobhan says, really, it's just a bit of a recap and talking through what this means for Wellington City Council and the other councils in the Wellington region, and how we're looking to organise ourselves and work together in relation to the reforms. Bit of a quick recap, and look, most of this will be known to you. Just to recap that, really the big decisions on the direction of the reforms came out in October, and a lot of the effort has been focused around the work of Doug's reform governance group and the transition unit kind of gearing up in the meantime. So in October, the government really made these big announcements on the reform, and essentially the key building blocks haven't really changed since that time. So number one, the decision around this being a mandatory legislated change, so there was no longer the ability for councils to opt in or opt out of the process. And the design of the reforms largely remained the same. So for water services entities, those key elements of governance, including protection against privatisation, competency-based boards, co-governance, balance sheet separation, and economic regulation, meaning that water assets and debt and revenue all gets transferred from councils to the water services entities from 1 July 2024. And there's a big funding package which goes with us of the $2 billion better off and no worse off funding. And this will all be given effect to through at least two pieces of legislation, with the first to be introduced, we thought was going to be early this year, which is now going to be mid 2022. So that's a kind of recap. And it hasn't really changed since October. So the key decisions were made in October, and we're still really waiting on the next key decision of government, which is going to be on the back of Doug's report, which is why there's such a lot of interest in that. So there's really two key work streams that we're working with in relation to the reforms. You've heard from Marlon in relation to transition, and there's also a whole work stream around policy and legislation, which is really where Doug's work feeds into. And I should just say that DIA are in the process of recruiting the two directors for each of these work streams. So as Marlon mentioned, he's acting in that position. And the two people that will be leading these two work streams should be announced in the next week or two, and will be really important in terms of one, driving the policy and legislation process, and two, driving the transition process and working really closely with councils on that. So on the policy and legislation front, you'll recall there was the process of councils providing feedback on the process, and one of the things which still hasn't been closed out yet is the responses to those 8-week letter process. So We are expecting a response by March, and why that's quite important is councils went to quite a lot of time and effort to raise a range of concerns and issues in relation to the reforms, and they've been waiting to hear back, and that'll help kind of frame how you might choose to respond to the reforms, positions that you put forward in relation to the select committee, or how you choose to engage with your communities. The working group has been really the key piece of work that's been going on, and as Doug said, it's been a very big undertaking. Around 40 people involved in that process. I've read most of their papers. Most of their papers are available online. They've had a huge amount of information and a number of different models and options. So we've been feeding some thinking into that, based on particularly that sub-regional representation concept of how to give effect to local voice and practice. So how that then lands is really the key question that we're not quite sure yet. So as Doug mentioned, his report's due out early March. Whether it'll be made public straight away or it'll go into some kind of government process, we're not quite clear. They've been trying to be very transparent, so we're expecting it will be public pretty much straight away. And that'll inform cabinet papers and then the shape of the bill. And so we'd expect that government will make some kind of cabinet decision late March or April, which means that we'll get clarity on the next stage, the next steps, how the government's actually responding to that recommendation, that report, and what the bill looks like as a result. So as Doug said, we've got an exposure draft, but we're expecting some changes to that exposure draft by April, May, which means we then get into the select committee process, which is really the key opportunity for public engagement. So it's an open process, obviously, that anyone can make a submission, and all councils will need to consider whether or not you make representation through the select committee process as well. And, obviously this legislation has significant bearing on all councils going forward. That legislation will then lead into a further round of more detailed legislation later in the year to give effect to the service entities. And also really important, as we discussed last year, not to lose sight of the work MBIE's doing on economic regulation. And the timing of policy decisions around that will be influenced by this broader process, but we're currently expecting Cabinet to make some kind of decisions on how that proceeds in around April as well. So there's quite a lot of work going on in that policy space, which will obviously consume quite a lot of time and effort across councils to respond to policy, respond to the select committee process, information for communities, etc. In relation to transition planning, as Marlon highlighted, look, there's a massive amount of work going on there. They're out recruiting at the moment. They're looking to have something like 150 staff in the National Transition Unit by June. So, there is a real implication here for councils and for Wellington Water that we're dealing with a very large delivery program. We're dealing with transition. We're dealing with new standards coming out of Taumata Arawai. So there's a real challenge across the whole of the water sector to maintain service for customers and the service levels that you're looking to get delivered. So that is real, and managing how the impacts on staff is going to be critical through this phase of work. The key next steps for the transition unit, we are expecting the transition director to be announced shortly, and they'll establish a board, and they are out recruiting for key staff. That will lead into the establishment of what they're calling local establishment entities, which are essentially the fledgling water services entities. And they'll have a CE, and looking to get those appointed by June. They're really important for us because they then provide that tension between a nationally coordinated and directed process and a process which is designed more at an entity level. And so that example that Marlon gave of an IT system, what IT system do they use? An option is to roll out the water care model, or an option is to go and develop another model. And I understand that's what the better business case process that Treasury's looking at the moment is to consider which is the best option there. I'm not sure that it's focused on those wider benefits that Mayor Foster was raising. I think that's a very good point that Doug's governance group is raising of how do you ensure the long-term benefits of reform are being tested, and does the model need to be improved and tweaked following a 5-year period. So some of the big work that's coming our way, we know, is these information requests. They potentially have a big demand across a range of people in our organisation. So we've got the first request, which is about people, and as Marlon said, we're expecting a number of subsequent requests. And the issue here is how that they're managed to make sure that we can do that really efficiently and effectively, because we know from previous experience that you'll typically get multiple requests for information. Of interest to you as well, in particular, I'm sure, is the Better Off funding. So we are expecting the criteria and the process and the application forms for the initial $500 million in the next few weeks, and that funding is available from the 1st of July. So as Marlon highlighted, indicatively, there's going to be a window for making applications, and there'll be a 5-year period for expenditure, and it's quite broad, the criteria about what that funding could potentially be used for. So that'll be something that that I'm sure you'll have an interest in. Also very important for Wellington City Council is the no worse off funding. So this is the funding to make sure that as a result of loss of assets, any council's no worse off financially in terms of their overall financial position. And the methodology for that still needs to be developed, and the methodology will require quite a lot of input from council. So I know Wellington City Council is looking to be actively involved in those discussions to make sure that methodology and process is really robust. So we've got a number of key challenges. So we're really trying to make sure that we're thinking about the impacts on the business while also being really efficient and effective about how we engage with the reforms process. And obviously that's really important for Wellington Water councils because we share data and services between Wellington Water and the councils. Currently there's not funding in place to support backfilling of staff or paying for consultants to support us in this process, but DIA do have a budget bid in with Treasury for that funding. We're still struggling to get some of the timeline and requirements from DIA clear, which affects our confidence about resources we need and the process that we need to go through. And there's a webinar and later on this afternoon, which Marlon had to leave to front, which hopefully provides a bit more detail on that. And the other key issues are there's still quite a few key political decisions to be gone through in terms of those cabinet decisions. And also there's a real range of public understanding of the reforms, as well as significant misinformation about why are the reforms occurring, what are the impacts on communities. And so that level of engagement information is really important. Happy to take questions, or I can finish off the slide as well very quickly if you like me, Foster. So very quickly, we're just looking to organise ourselves through working together across the Wellington councils, building a good relationship with DIA teams, influence those where we can through the reference groups and working groups, ensure there's good, clear public information, and support good engagement across councils as well going forward. I think those are really the key steps from me, Mr. Chair, so I'm happy to take any questions on that.
Thanks, Dewey. We've got a couple of questions, and yes, Mayor Foster, would you like to open up?
Yeah, look, Dougal, thank you. The question I wanted to ask you is about what you said about it being a real issue at the moment in terms of the pressure on staffing. Now, there's two things there. One is that staff are essentially coming out of existing water units, etc. But the other one is, I got the feeling you were talking about saying this is actually putting taking time out of staff who are actually still staying within, for example, Wellington Water. Is that the case?
There will be a range of, so firstly, the National Transition Unit and the local establishment teams are in the process of actively recruiting. That will have an impact on some staff across a range of organisations, both organisations like Wellington Water and also councils, not just in Wellington. So that's one impact. As staff potentially move across those establishment units, backfilling them may prove challenging as people move around. Secondly, the transition process does create a bow of work. For example, the data requests will have an impact on your finance team, on your asset management teams, on your HR teams to pull together that information. So it's another thing on top of their day job. And so making sure we're trying to do that in a really effective and efficient way is going to be quite important.
So can I just follow that? That says a lot of those sound like they're councils, but I suspect that will be Wellington Waters as well. So when Wellington Water then turns around and says that they need more money from us, that's a bit of a problem. should we be saying to ask them to quantify exactly what that cost is, and then going to DIA and saying, hey guys, maybe this is your process, maybe you should be helping us out for this so that we don't have to put yet more on the rates, or tell Wellington Water they can't do some things that we actually want them to do.
Yeah, look, I think Wellington Water have a range of really great people who can help shape these reforms. So, for example, we're the second, through Wellington Water, we're the second or third biggest employer of water-based staff in New Zealand. So having people who understand the workforce being involved in the HR work streams of transition is really important. We've got great asset management people who can help influence that process as well. So that's really important too. I think in terms of backfilling all the costs of that, we've begun a conversation with DIA about the potential costs, and we've started to pull together a kind of an estimate of what those costs would be across Wellington Water and across the councils. We currently have some stimulus funding which can meet some of those costs, but we are certainly looking to follow that up with DIA to get some additional funding as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, can I encourage you to do that, because that's very real and very now for us, and we've got an annual plan to put out, and if I can avoid anything that puts yet more pressure on or reduces the level of service we can provide, then I'm very keen to do that.
Okay, Councillor Pennant.
Thanks, Dougal. Can I ask two questions? First of all, you talked about the level of misinformation out there, but is it also true that maybe people just don't agree with government? And also, if you start off with engaging, but you're misinformed, how much engagement do you expect? And how much engagement do you expect when it looks like the government, well, may or may not change its mind?
Yeah, look, a really good question. So, you'll know how many submissions you typically get through your annual plan process or long-term plan process on water issues. Typically, it's not a huge number, but water does have a massive impact on people's lives, not just drinking water, but the issue raised before about interest in stormwater impacts on streams. So people have a real interest in this issue. I think the challenge for councils is that this is a government-led reform process, and the engagement process is a government-led process, and the select committee is the key opportunity for public participation in that. So the role that councils play in relation to that is being carefully considered by councils around our region. And particularly what's coming through is how do we ensure our communities have good, clear information about what's proposed, why change is proposed, and what that might mean for communities.
Thanks, Councillor Conley.
Thank you. Thanks, Dougal. I'm really just trying to get my head around kind of what our job is for the next 12 months, because there's so much going on. So can I just start with what are, as you said, there's actually a lot of the decisions now not being made by councils, they're being made at central government level. So what are the decisions that we have in front of us in the next 12 months? You talked about deciding whether we wanted to submit to select committee on the bills. There maybe is something about making decisions about better off funding applications. Is there anything else?
In terms of key decisions, again, it's a government-led reform process. So if government legislates for the change to proceed, you effectively don't have a decision to make on that point. You will need to make a decision about whether you make a submission through the select committee process and how you position that. So that's a key point. You'll need to make a decision about how you choose to provide information to support your community, to help them understand the reform and the opportunities that they have in relation to that. And you'll need to make decisions about how you might approach the better off funding opportunity and application process. So those, I think, are three key decisions over the next 6 months. A lot of this is really about working with DIA to shape the process for the reforms, to shape how it occurs, and representing the views of your community. I mean, the points that were being raised earlier on in relation to the discussion with Marlon and Doug around how do you ensure local voice, how do you ensure the views of customers, how do you ensure the views of your communities. I think there's real opportunity to continue to influence how this process goes forward so that there are good outcomes for our communities going forward.
Thanks, Dougal. That leads nicely to my next question, which is about given that most of our power at this point is kind of opportunities to influence, what do you see are our kind of most effective levers for influence? Because again, as a councillor, I can kind of see lots of different places where things are happening. What do you think from inside the machine are our most effective levers for influence? Is it the NCC Mayors Group? Is it Let's Get Local Government New Zealand? Is it the Wellington Water Committee? Where should we be putting our effort?
Yeah, look, there's a number of areas where we're continuing to try and influence. So it's building a relationship with DIA as the new roles established. So we've got some key new roles which will be up and running in the next few weeks around those directors, and making sure that they're really aware of the concerns that have been raised, and the opportunity to work with local government on the design of this process is really important. Getting some good staff into the reference groups, I think, is really important, and there's been a number of good representations from across the Wellington councils to be involved in those representative groups. The approach to select committee, I think, is really important as well, and putting good, clear representation forward about how to improve the bill when that's released. So I think those are some good opportunities there. But as I say, largely the decision-making process does sit with government on this.
Thanks, Dougal. My last question is just, what do you think are the key things that we should be monitoring as governors as this process goes forward in the next year? What do we really need to be keeping our finger on the pulse?
I think there's a number of things there. I mean, one is making sure that as an organisation, you're continuing to be able to deliver good water services for the people of Wellington, and therefore making sure that Wellington Water is kind of looked after through this process is really important. It's a challenging time for the whole water sector over the next 2 years, to be fair. So I think number one, the basics, really making sure that good water services do continue to get delivered, and to some degree that means looking after Wellington Water. Number two, I think really making sure that there's good, clear information for communities about what the change means in practice. And number three, the third point, I think, is really just continuing to influence how the reforms proceed and how the new entities start to be established, so that there is good, clear voice for local communities, that the councils and communities are well represented through the establishment of the entities. The establishment of the new entities, these are going to be some of the biggest organisations in New Zealand. They are, as Doug said, there is a risk that they could run away and not respond to the views of local communities, but I think there's a lot of debate and a lot of push to make sure that that's not the case, but we can't lose sight of that. I think it's really important to continue to foster the relationship with the fledgling organisations as they're established, to build that relationship, to build that understanding of local needs, and make sure that they're actually held to account in terms of doing that.
Thanks. I do have a bit of a curly question for you, Dougal. It might be a bit of an unfair one for you. But I wondered, Siobhan, Barbara, do you guys have any questions that you might want to ask? No, you're okay? Good.
Yeah.
So we heard from Helen, Mayor Helen Warboys this morning about who's chairing the Coalition for Local Voices. And I didn't hear anything there that was necessarily that inconsistent with what might come out of this process, Dougal, anyway. I'm just wondering, I mean, we've had a sort of brief discussion between councillors and officers about possibly joining up with that group, and we haven't gone there at the moment. But if we were to do something to do that, like Dunedin did, I believe, today as well, would that be a fundamental problem for Wellington Water as a lobby group to work collaboratively, or does it mean that we've kind of fallen out of the government process, or would it just be seen as a bit of bad faith?
Well, I think one, I guess, Wellington Water is apolitical in this process. They are the CCO of the owner council, so they're not getting involved in that from a political process at all. In terms of the politics, I think what a lot of councils have tried to do is work within the government's process, work within the tent. As was noted earlier, you've got good representation within Doug's working group, and his report is going to be out in the next couple of weeks. So I think that'll give you a bit of a sense of direction of travel. So I can't really answer in terms of the pros and cons of joining that group, though.
Well, I knew it was a bit unfair. That's why I suppose maybe a fairer question would be to say, are the councils that are making up Coalition for Local Voices, are they currently working within the process, but as a collective?
Yeah, look, I can't really answer that in too much detail. Sorry, Sean, in that I don't know too much about what they're doing. I know that they did make a presentation to Doug's working group. I think from what I know, they're quite focused on retaining council ownership of water assets, which would mean a tying back of assets to balance sheets. And therefore that's kind of at odds with one of those government bottom lines. As I heard Doug say on another call, the government's made some fundamental decisions, and so there has to be quite a high bar to challenge those decisions. So has there been evidence brought forward by that group to challenge those? I guess that's the question, and how they'd approach that.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Councillor Rush, it might be worth my commenting a little on this too, because the council did make a decision last year about the way it wished to collaborate with others through this process. And of course, that is being done through the group of Entity C or proposed Entity C mayors, and the collaboration that has been undertaken between the shareholding councils of Wellington Water, hence the way in which we're working with Dougal and with others. And then if you listen to what Doug Martin has said this afternoon, many different points of view are have been proposed to that working group, and Wellington City Council's views have also been proposed through that process, and we will get a response to them. And so I think if the question is where should Wellington City Council sit in this politically, I'm just pointing out that you gave us strong direction about that in the decision made in September last year. And that's what we're implementing. As you know, Councillor Rush, I have conveyed to you.
Chairman Rush, actually, Madam CEO. That's
Chairman
fine,
Rush.
Understood. I see another couple of questions have popped up, and I think I might have just livened up a few things, maybe, I don't know. But Deputy Mayor Free.
Thank you. One of the interesting things that Mayor Walboys did say was in this issue of capital, of balance sheets and capital raising. She said that an entity could raise capital, you'd disconnect the balance sheet connection as long as no council had more than 40% of an entity. So she that's what I understood her to say, and I just wondered if you know anything about that. Okay, I can see Denny's shaking her head. I'm happy to have that answered by anybody, because I was interested I thought that's what she said. I may have misunderstood what she said. But I was interested in
sending an email to officers, Deputy Mayor, and it's
maybe Jenny's got a quick answer.
Jenny's got a PhD.
I'm happy to start to answer that. My expression was just to say that I agree that is what she said, but in my view, I'm not sure that that's actually an accurate representation of what the requirements of balance sheet separation are, which was part of my question to Doug Martin about how clear some of our councillors are about what those requirements are. But I'll leave it at that.
So maybe it's something that I could have an answer by email or I don't know, Doug, whether you're the right person to provide that, or whether I need to go back to Mr. Martin.
Councillor Free, we can, if the question is what does ensuring that this doesn't impact our balance sheet. Is that the question?
It is,
Right.
because a lot of the rationale for this bigger entity is about raising capital and debt. So I do want to understand that.
Okay, we're very clear about that, but we can send an update to councillors on that question.
Thanks, Barbara. All right, folks, well, we're finishing 25 minutes early, which is what we do in infrastructure. Oh, hey, hang on. No. Councillor Condi.
Sorry, I've got another question. Just because of a couple of things Dougal responded to you. One of my question was about, is there anything you can tell us, Dougal, about the debate or what happened at Dunedin City Council? Because we particularly had it mentioned this morning that Dunedin City Council had signed up to the Communities for Local Democracy, but I understand that the mayor didn't support that. Is there any? Can you shed any light on that for us, or is that
any goss?
Any goss?
Look, I'm aware that it was a very close vote, 8-7, and it is not. It was not the mayor's desire to see Dunedin City Council join the group.
Oh, we vote against our mayor all the time.
I've got one more question, which is just to pick up your comment, Dougal, which I thought was really helpful, that you felt that the Communities for Local Democracy, one of their key issues is around asset ownership and not wanting to transfer asset ownership to these entities. Because one of the key recommendations of the mayoral task force was that balance sheet separation was essential and that asset ownership should be transferred to a new entity. There was disagreement about scale, but there was agreement about absolute asset ownership transfer and balance sheet separation. In your view, do you think that the Communities for Local Democracy in that way is incompatible, their views are incompatible with the findings of the mayoral task force?
Oh, sorry, I really couldn't respond to that in detail, and that I haven't seen the kind of the detailed proposal from the Communities for Local Democracy. I think one of the key issues that has been debated is, who owns the assets, and one of the key points that has been put back is they would remain in public ownership. So currently they are, owned by councils on behalf of communities, and the intent is that in the future, under the government proposal, that they'd be owned by the water services entities on behalf of the public. So it's a transference of asset from one public organisation to another, rather than privatisation or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Dougal. And on that, I think we'll conclude the meeting and say thanks also to those other attendees who gave us presentations. Thank you so much, Barbara and Siobhan, for organising it. It was really good to get that sort of level of detail from the guys who are at the coalface and about to put out the report. So I think let's all wait until we see the report before we think about what might happen next. All right.